Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Happy holiday season and welcome to Fuel the Pedal podcast. Again, I am your host, Gabriel Martins, broadcasting today from Portugal, from the lovely region of Algarve where my roots lie. I hope you had a Merry Christmas with your loved ones and that you're looking forward to New Year's Eve with great expectations for 2020. You might have guessed by now that this is a different episode, a rather short celebration and a yearly summary of everything that has been going on here on Fuel the Pedal podcast since its first episode on the 25th of February on this present year 2019. It's been a very busy but rewarding year, and although Fuel the Pedal is just a hobby of mine that I try to keep alive and conciliate with my work, it was unquestionably a meaningful part of this year and ended up fortunately growing much more than I initially expected, and I'll do my best to keep this show alive for the next year to come. For that, you, the listeners, had the crucial role in all of this. Each kind email, social media message, comment, spreading of the word, but mainly the simple fact that you're there listening on that side while driving, at home, at work, or while cycling. I know I do that for the podcasts I listen. For that, please accept my humble gratitude for listening, and I hope you remain faithful listeners throughout 2020. I can assure you that there are some amazing guest speakers to begin the year in the best way possible, and many more will surely come. My second thanks goes, of course, to all the guests that accepted being on the show, and these include Javier Gonzalez, Sam Impey, Stephen Chong, Kevin Miller, Nikki Key, Jamie Pugh, Stuart Phillips, Philippe Teixeira, James Kennedy, Lewis James, Daniel Moore, Mark Evans, James Morton, Brian Saunders, Melinda Monor, and Trent Stellingworth. To all of you, many thanks for accepting being on the show and provide such high quality information in a variety of topics. And without you, of course, none of this would have been possible. So today we'll try to go over all the episodes that aired throughout this year and provide a brief summary while revisiting each episode in order of appearance. Just 1 or 2 minutes of the main take-home messages from each episode. So if you didn't have the chance to hear a particular episode, or if you want to revisit some episode that really interested you, stay put to what is yet to come on this episode. And we'll start, of course, with episode 1 with Dr. Javier Gonzalez, where we talked about breakfast for cyclists. Javier was the first invitation I sent, and he immediately accepted taking the risk in being the first guest on Fuel the Pedal podcast. I've already extended my thanks to Javier during this holiday season, but here it is again in case you're listening, Javier. Many thanks for your insights on episode 1 of Fuel the Pedal podcast, Breakfast for Cyclists. Should they deplete before they eat? Or basically, when should we skip or when should we have breakfast in order to promote training adaptations to specific cycling workouts?
So I'd advise that they do a mixture of consuming breakfast on Sundays, on days where they've got a particularly intense session that they want to maximize their performance on, and certainly in competition. And then vary that with other days when perhaps the intensity of the session isn't going to be high, or they want to specifically promote certain adaptations in their muscle, then they should perhaps consider performing those sessions in a fasted state. Whether they achieve that with essentially a true fasted state exercise, or whether they just do a carbohydrate restriction, would probably depend on the athlete preferences and their specific goals at that time. Maybe if you've got an athlete who is commonly getting stress fractures, then you may not want to do so much of the fasted exercise training, and you could use some of the protein intake there too, which has been shown by some to suppress these markers of bone breakdown during exercise. So essentially it would be to vary it, and when performance should be maximized, then consuming a high carbohydrate breakfast containing a mixture of carbohydrate sources and also some protein as well. And then performing some sessions with some form of carbohydrate availability, with or without protein, depending on the type of athlete you're working with.
Then, on episode 2, Sam Impey accepted to get on board and extend a bit on the topic of fuel for the work required, a terminology that became popular thanks to a framework model developed during his PhD research back at Liverpool John Moores University, along with James Morton and Graham Close. This really simple framework, based on different colors on low, medium, and high carbohydrate intake in different meals really helps us nutritionists and cyclists provide a meal-by-meal approach and a smart carbohydrate manipulation in order to maximize training adaptations without compromising performance. Sam taught us how to adapt this carbohydrate ingestion to specific training sessions in order to promote these adaptations, as well as practical applications that Sam performed in his experience with Mitchelton Scott cycling team. Let's hear it again from Sam Impey.
So how can you fuel the training session appropriately so that you're not compromising on the intensity or the duration or the training goals, but actually equally not over-fueling it so that you're not going to kind of potentially dampen any of the adaptive responses that we see with coming towards what we term the kind of critical glycogen threshold. But then also, are there kind of sessions during the week where actually you can kind of pair your carbohydrate availability and your energy availability right back? So things like much lower intensity, almost like kind of recovery type rides in terms of maybe they're an hour to 2 hours at very low intensity. Maybe you can pair that right back, and you could almost do that fasted or with no exogenous carbohydrate availability. And that, again, is just a way to kind of manipulate the exogenous and endogenous carbohydrate stores so that you can kind of get the most bang for your buck from the type of training that you're doing. If you're going to be doing high intensity sessions, so if you're going to be doing threshold efforts, repeated threshold efforts or VO2 efforts, then quite obviously you need to fuel that with carbohydrates because it's a highly glycolytic type session and you're going to need a lot of muscle glycogen and a lot of carbohydrate to sustain that type of work. So that's obviously kind of where you go to, you have your fueling plan that builds into that. But then actually after that session, you look at what the next session is, whether that's the next day or if you've got, 2 in a day, then actually what's the kind of how much feeding or how much carbohydrate do we need to put back in? If you have a low intensity session the next day, then actually you can just put a kind of moderate amount of carbohydrate back in so that you can activate those recovery processes and not kind of blunt that, but equally not overfuel so that maybe you can start the next session with slightly lower muscle glycogen because that's a targeted sort of train low type session. But then we know that the session after that is going to be high intensity again, so we refuel so that you're not ever compromising on the quality of the type of training that you're trying to do. So it's really taking the training plan or taking your training plan, and the more information you have on the training that you're doing, the better that you can make your plan. So it's more strategic, your fueling plan. So it's more strategic to the type of training that you're doing, which then allows you to kind of make each of the training sessions and your fueling patterns more efficient and more bespoke to the athlete, which hopefully then can bring about greater adaptations.
On episode 3, we switched gears completely and went to Canada, more precisely to Brock University, where Dr. Stephen Chung told us everything about thermal stress, heat adaptation, and cycling performance. What aspects and details could we try to control in order to properly acclimate the cyclist to a certain environment, and how can specific nutrition interventions contribute to minimize the thermal stress that endurance athletes are often exposed to? Let's hear it again from Dr. Stephen Chung.
One way we can deal with the heat is to drink cold water or almost at ice temperature levels. So that's one way to drop temperature. Another way is to actually have essentially kind of your slushies or your ice slurries. The theory there is that the drink is at 0 degrees, but you are both having to melt the ice, and that costs a lot of heat, or that can extract a lot of heat from your body, and then you raise the temperature once it's melted. Whereas with kind of cold water, all you're doing is raising the temperature. So the benefit theoretically of ice slurry is for each amount that you ingest, it takes a lot more energy or it can suck away a lot more heat from your body than if it was just water. So that's the theory of it. And so it can be used as part of your warm-up strategy. So if you are, again, warming up before a race on a trainer on a hot day, you can take in and eat some ice slurry, and there's special bottles that are designed to really hold kind of slurries rather than just water. So that's one thing that you can be doing to try to keep your body temperature as cool as possible as you are warming up. The second part is menthol. Menthol by itself is really kind of that cooling feeling. You may have some kind of gels that have this menthol, and you put it on your body and your skin feels really cool. And so it has actually no physiological effect. It is not as if it is cooling your body in any way, shape, or form, but it is giving your skin that cool feeling. And there's been intriguing studies, whether it's kind of menthol kind of covered on your body or even kind of menthol in liquid, that it seems to feel cool, and therefore going back to what we've been talking about, the whole psychology of exercise and exercise tolerance in the heat, it seems to decrease your thermal discomfort and your thermal distress in the heat, and therefore allows you to keep working.
Episode 4 was a fantastic one on a topic that I was really looking forward to tackle. In endurance sports, you often hear the craziest theories regarding muscle cramps. Why do they happen? How can you treat them? From magnesium to salt to stretching, many were the popular theories. But thanks to one of my greatest mentors from Portugal, Professor Victor Hugo Teixeira, the research regarding pickled juice ingestion to treat muscle cramps came to my attention, and the same name kept on popping up in all the articles. Kevin Miller. It was tricky to get to contact him, but fortunately we made it, and this episode finally came to be. Let's hear it from Kevin Miller on pickled juice and the science behind muscle cramps.
We simply gave people small volumes of pickle juice, so about 80 milliliters of pickle juice, or 1 mil per kilogram body mass, and we simply measured whether or not there were any changes in blood electrolytes, because so many people were giving pickle juice to athletes and believing that the pickle juice was relieving the cramp because of changes in things like sodium or magnesium or calcium in the bloodstream. And so we just really want to know, well, can you even affect the blood electrolyte levels if you drink 80 mils of fluid in 30 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes, 60 minutes, etc.? And so we did several studies, actually over the course of several years, where we gave people small volumes of pickle juice, and then we measured their blood at several times after they drank pickle juice as well as before they drank the pickle juice. And we did this in dehydrated humans. We did this in euhydrated humans. We did multiple boluses of pickle juice with exercise. We looked at pickle juice and its effect on performance, its effect on sweating. And what we found was when you give small volumes of pickle juice to healthy, physically active people, nothing really changes in the bloodstream. There's no appreciable increase in blood sodium concentration, potassium concentration, calcium, magnesium, chloride, plasma volume. None of these things really change. And so that was fascinating to us because we did another study that got published in 2010 in the journal Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise, where we actually gave people pickle juice, deionized water, or nothing at all in a double-blind fashion. And so we gave them those things while they were actually cramping. And what we noticed was the pickle juice actually relieved an active cramp about 37% faster than deionized water and 45% faster than when our subjects drank absolutely nothing. And so with all the data that we had at the time, were no changes in blood sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and even a study that we showed pickle juice sat in the stomach for about 25 minutes before it finally left the stomach and was able to be absorbed into the bloodstream. We had a phenomenon where it seemed like pickle juice was relieving an active cramp better than water or nothing at all, and yet there were no major changes to the primary blood electrolytes or other blood variables. And so we found this absolutely fascinating, and the cramps were going away in about 90 seconds. And so it wasn't quite as fast as the 30 seconds that we read about in the case studies, but it was still very fast. And so with no changes in the blood, with the pickle juice sitting in the stomach for 25 minutes, yet relieving a cramp in about 90 seconds, we thought, well, this has to be a neurological phenomenon. And so we hypothesized that the vinegar in the pickle juice acts as kind of like a counter irritant in the mouth and causes a disruption in the overexcitation that's happening from the central nervous system that interrupts the signaling to the cramping muscle and causes the cramp to actually stop.
Of course, this makes it look like as if pickle juice is the panacea to all cramping problems, but the etiology of muscle cramping is multifactorial, and I advise you to listen to the full episode to hear the balanced message that Dr. Kevin Miller left us with. Moving on to episode 5, where we talked about bare bones in cyclists with Dr. Nikki Key, where we went around some of her work with male cyclists and their low bone mineral density as a result of lacking in load-bearing activities throughout their career and also due to low energy availability. Let's hear a glimpse on episode 5.
So nearly half of them, 44% of them, were at or below that worrying level. So the extent of it, yes, I was surprised, shocked, and even especially in the ones that were in chronic low energy availability. I mean, some of them, they were actually coming into the osteoporotic range. So, they had a very sort of generalized, for example, a 25-year-old having the bones of an 85-year-old. I mean, and this is a fit athlete, that is a concern, obviously. And if you look at the types of injury in the pro peloton, in the pro cycle stats, if you look at that injury list, the first thing that struck me was that the majority are fractures, whereas if you're looking at rugby's or something like this, it's often soft tissue. So first of all, there's a lot of fractures happening. I know people are going to turn around and say, well, bike crashes happen, I accept that, and you fall off and you're going to, collarbone, we know that's a very common injury. But you could argue that if your bones are already in a weakened condition and you fall off, maybe you're going to sustain a more serious fracture than you would otherwise have done if your bones were in decent health. And particularly the vertebral fracture is a really, really nasty fracture.
Moving on to episode 6 with one of the nicest speakers I've had here on the show and an absolute joy to chat with in and out of the podcast. I'm talking about Jamie Pugh from Liverpool John Moores University. And Jamie accepted being on the podcast to talk about gastrointestinal symptoms in cycling and the importance of training race nutrition in order to minimize such symptoms. Let's hear it again, one of the main take-home messages from that episode.
I think it's amazing how many athletes will think of everything and cover all bases, but then don't do something as simple as thinking about and practicing the food that they're going to eat before a race. I think if you can try some of these out in maybe some practice races or some practice training sessions before a major event, it will give athletes and coaches or nutritionists a much better idea of what athletes feel is tolerable, what sort of foods are they comfortable having, and things like this. As I said, we know that, for example, fluids will empty from the stomach a lot quicker than food, for example, whole food. So if an athlete maybe doesn't feel hungry or is slightly conscious of what they're going to take in, a high carbohydrate drink could be a good option. If an athlete, though, feels that they're going to be hungry, then maybe it needs to be something of a slightly higher volume, some food. But if it's something like white rice, we know that's going to be low in fibre, high GI, high in carbohydrate, that could be an option. So it's all of these things that just need to be thought about, but also then practiced. And although it's difficult to replicate the high pressure or the high stress that might come before a race, you can still control some of these and make sure that your athlete is going to be happy and comfortable and confident in what they're going to be eating before they then go take part in the race.
As for episode 7, I will skip that one since it was a solo episode where I talked about carbohydrate mouth rinse application in cycling based on one research paper we had recently published back then. Since I want this yearly episode digest to be all about the guests on Fuel the Pedal podcast, I'll just invite you to listen to episode 7 if you want to know more about carbohydrate mouth rinse practical applications. On to episode 8, and probably the most popular one so far, with 2 guests, Dr. Stuart Phillips and my good friend Felipe Teixeira, who came to talk about BCAAs, glutamine, collagen and HMB use in cycling and endurance sports. Let's go back and hear it again.
I don't think that there's anything particularly special to branched chains. I think it's a leucine-mediated effect, to be really honest with you. And protein in and of itself, whey protein in particular, would be just as effective. And, in my opinion, since you've got all of the other essential amino acids in whey protein, it would probably be a better or, if you like, a more effective recovery strategy as compared to branched chain amino acids. So, my broad view of the literature in this area is that they've received a lot of attention because there's probably an effect there, but it's an effect mediated by one of the 3 amino acids. The other 2 aren't particularly important. And when you look at it in totality, I think that whey protein would probably do as good or probably even a better job.
The issue with glutamine on recovery, in my view, stems from 2 papers, one from Leibot in 2015 and other from Waldron also in 2015, I believe. However, we have to look into the whole body of evidence. And what do we know about glutamine? Well, we know it doesn't improve high-intensity exercise. We know it doesn't improve maximal effort in cycling. Maybe it might improve hydration. However, it has no effect on performance or body composition or catabolism, and its anticatabolic actions are seen mainly from intravenous administration. When it works on performance, it's curious because it's usually administered with also carbohydrates. I think the best evidence regarding glutamine is fairly recent. It's a clinical nutrition paper in 2018, and it states basically this. It has no effect on the immune system, no effect on body composition, and the only effect that you detect are basically due to body fluid balance. It has no effect on growth hormone, no effect on creatine kinase or aerobic capacity. So these are, to the glutamine believers, really disappointing results. If it works, then it's mainly on clinical settings or in critically ill patients.
And so we reach episode 9, the episode where I tried to bring a topic that I have much interest in, which is orthorexia, or the obsession with dieting and clean eating that might affect athletic and non-athletic populations. And I decided to bring James Kennedy, a chemistry professor in Australia who has authored the book on chemophobia and the irrational fear that we have nowadays with anything that is chemical/artificial. You might recognize James's work thanks to his infographic on the all-natural banana, where you can see a list of all the naturally occurring chemicals that exist in a banana. So, without further ado, let's hear some of James's comments on this.
I would categorize eating disorders, including orthorexia, as a form of chemophobia, because everybody's eating disorder has, or obsession with nutrition has certain they've cut the food pyramid in half in their specific way. And they've said, I eat nuts, I don't eat fish. I don't eat red meat, I do eat chicken. I don't eat this, I don't eat, and they cut the food pyramid in their own particular way to make themselves unique, I think. It's almost like creating an identity for yourself and giving you something to talk about. And then they find evidence and research, they cherry pick research to justify, why this is particularly bad. And newspaper outlets love it. They can easily feed this kind of audience with equally polarizing headlines. There's the classic Daily Mail list of things that are good and bad for you. I don't know if you've seen the Daily Mail almost on a daily basis is telling you that, chocolate's good for you, wine is bad for you, and then the other way around the following week. But it just resonates with people. That's what they're looking for.
Episode 10 featured Dr. Lewis James from Loughborough University on the importance of milk in cycling, particularly in the recovery period. Lewis is someone I really enjoy chatting with. I've had the pleasure to meet with him in person in a congress here in Madrid not long ago, and it's always a pleasure to spend some time with him. Lewis is one of those characters from whom you can always learn a lot from, but at the same time he's very humble and funny to be around. Thanks again, Lewis, for your kindness. Let's go back and revisit episode 10 on the role of milk as a post-exercise recovery drink.
My position isn't that everyone should consume milk or at all opportunities. It's not a question of one food against another. I think it's an important food group for milk and dairy, really, because we're talking about milk, but more widely dairy products. They're an important food group for a number of vital nutrients for many populations across the globe, and they are one of many foods that can be used in certain settings. I think the benefit of milk for the athlete particularly is the convenience and the cost. Those are the two things that make it a really good, viable option for recovery in many athletic situations, including endurance sports and cycling. In terms of the kind of reputation of milk, I guess, over the years, there's far more evidence on the kind of positive side of health benefits for milk. If we're looking at, cardiovascular disease, bone health, all of these different factors of health, aging, regulation of muscle mass, providing protein for that sort of thing, calcium in growth, all of these sort of things. And I think my view is that demonizing any food group is a negative thing, particularly in the case of food groups that are really common parts of people's daily diet. You tend to see that if somebody who is not appropriately educated or doesn't have the requisite knowledge to replace that food or food group with other sources that contain the nutrients that are within that food or food group, then they're at risk of some level of deficiency, whether it's marginal or full deficiency. So I think demonizing a food group and removing any food group from somebody's diet is often a negative thing.
On episode 11, we traveled to Canada, more precisely to the University of Toronto, where Dr. Daniel Mord is based in. Daniel accepted being on Fuel the Pedal to talk about all things protein for endurance sports with a focus on cycling. Let's look back to a sample of that episode when referring to protein inclusion in a pre-race meal.
If it's a one-off race where you're going to have more than, say, 48 hours to recover before your next training or bout or race, then the pre-event meal should really be designed to top up your carbohydrate stores and minimize any GI distress you might have during the race. I think those are the most important factors. Now, if you're talking about a multi-day race or someone who's training multiple days, there is an advantage, I believe, to consuming some protein before the event with breakfast, for the reason we just indicated, that it's going to help the body might use those amino acids as fuel before it starts to break down body proteins, and it might put you in a better position to recover after the race. I think what we have to be mindful of, though, is that protein has a high thermic effect, and that's because it basically it takes energy for our body to break it down. And so the athlete wants to make sure they're not consuming a large amount of protein within about an hour or two before the event, because that can also cause GI distress. So there could be some tinkering in there as far as how much protein is in the breakfast or how early before the race that it's consumed. But certainly you don't want to be 30 minutes into a race and start to get some GI distress, which eating too much protein or protein that is fatty, eggs and bacon, we love our bacon here in Canada. Too much of that before a race is probably not going to put you in a good position.
Mark Evans, a nutritionist colleague from the University of Dublin, accepted to be on episode 12 to talk us about exogenous ketone supplementation in cycling, which had been the topic of his PhD research. This is one episode that must be listened in full to properly understand the context of exogenous ketones in endurance sport, so brilliantly presented by Mark. Let's hear some of his take-home messages regarding this topic.
I think in terms of who would actually benefit from using these supplements, again, based on the data that we have at the moment, to me, the the only supplement worth considering at the moment would be the BHB monoester. And then who is it actually aimed for? Who would get a benefit from using it? Well, I think that endurance athletes, so again, we're mainly talking about cyclists here, highly trained, they have a high VO2 max, they have a higher capacity to extract ketones and actually use them as a source of fuel. So it's going to be these guys that are competing in long events, so events that result in severe energy depletion. So even events that, it's hard to ingest or use that amount of carbohydrate supplements as whether it's to get the benefits of another energy source, or whether it's like the more metabolic benefits that we haven't touched on too much. So highly trained guys competing in long events that result in energy depletion. Now, is it budget dependent at the moment? It's a simple answer. I think it is. If you go onto the Human website at the moment, HVMN website, a one-time order of 3 bottles of the ester costs $99. So if you're looking to use that as a weight loss strategy, that's going to probably cost you a lot of money. Whereas if you want to use it, try it out as an acute performance enhancing strategy, fire ahead. And see what it does for you. But yeah, I think definitely at the moment, I'm not surprised that the only people that were really talking about using it are, teams with high budgets, or just generally Tour de France teams. And it might be at the moment, based on the research, not there probably isn't enough to back up its use yet in kind of your everyday or kind of the major proportion of athletes that people are dealing with.
Episode lucky number 13. Now, having a podcast on cycling nutrition, there is one guest that was obvious from the beginning. If there is one person who single-handedly was responsible to put cycling nutrition on the map, thanks to his crucial role on Team Sky as the leading performance nutritionist, that person was Dr. James Morton. I got excited and we recorded a really long interview that we then decided that could be on 2 episodes. So episode 14 also features Dr. James Morton as well. We covered a lot of different topics, from logistics on a grand tour to some of his important research regarding fuel for the work required and training low strategies, that it would be impossible to summarize it all here. So let's have a sneak peek on episode 13 and 14 with Dr. James Morton.
Nutrition in cycling can be the difference between winning and losing, and it can take a good rider to a great rider, and we've seen that in the last 4.5 years. We've seen riders really improve their performance because they've changed their dietary habits, and so now nutrition is an integral part of the performance team. All of the coaches, the sports directors, the carers, everyone in my time there really bought into what we were trying to do. And we spent a lot of time educating all of the staff on the different protocols and why this drink was important, better than this drink, and why this recovery drink was important, or why we were changing the amount of carbohydrate on this day versus another day, and so on. But in the end, everyone almost really got to the same level. And they pretty much knew the nutritional strategy and the philosophy of the team. And that was because we all got aligned and we all had a shared vision and shared goals of where we wanted to get to, which I don't really see happening in many other sports, if I'm being honest, from some of the sports that I've seen. I think that was the difference with Team Sky, was that we all got round the table, we all told each other how we felt, and then off we went in the same direction. Cyclists only perform 1 session per day. That session usually starts around 10 a.m. and it could go on to 2, 3 or 4 p.m. on that afternoon. So therefore, how do you change the carbohydrate every day for that session when they're only training once per day? Because you can't really do a sleep low, train low, or you can't really do a twice per day session when they've only got the 1 session per day. But what you can do is you can change your carbohydrate at every meal in accordance with the fuel for the work required principle. And what that really means then is that you're thinking 2 or 3 days in advance, because in my time in cycling, every training session was different. So you would never really do 2 of the same sessions on consecutive days. And so therefore we then came up with that traffic light system where we would change the carbohydrate at breakfast or on the bike or at lunch or in the evening meal, depending what the session looked like today, but also what did the session look like tomorrow and the day after. And so fuel for the work required then really means adjusting your carbohydrate intake day by day, meal by meal, in accordance with the upcoming workload.
And from the UK, we traveled to Brazil, to the University of São Paulo, where Brian Saunders kindly provided us with much needed guidance on buffers in cycling, more specifically beta-alanine and sodium bicarbonate supplementation in cycling. Now, I've met Brian in Brussels in this 2019 edition of the Science in Cycling Conference, and I'll repeat again what I've said on this episode. Brian is a tremendous guy to be around, a really charismatic and smart person. Besides, he's a cycling aficionado and a casual rider as well. What not to love? Let's hope we can meet someday in the mountains of Madrid for some epic rides. Until then, please listen to Brian's take-home message regarding buffers in cycling.
For beta-alanine, my recommendation would probably be a minimum of 4 weeks of supplementation at a dose of between 3.2 and 6.4 grams per day. You can stagger those doses throughout the day depending on your tolerance to paresthesia, and to simply continue to maintain that throughout the season, because we know that if you stop supplementation with beta-alanine, your muscle carnosine will return to normal levels as well. Regarding sodium bicarbonate, as an acute supplement, we generally recommend a relative dose to your body mass, so 0.3 grams per kilogram of body mass, shortly before exercise. If you think about prolonged exercise and exercise stage, I don't necessarily think that timing matters too much, as generally increase circulating bicarbonate for sort of 1 to 3 hours post supplementation. But maybe if you're expecting an intense period at the start or at the end of a race, you could plan your ingestion according to that.
On episode 16, we had the pleasure to have Dr. Melinda Monor from Oregon State University to finally have a full episode just on the health and performance issues regarding female cyclists. Now, this is a topic that hopefully we will be able to further expand on 2020. We've started to tackle some of the most urgent issues to pay attention to, and we alerted to the fact that we are still lacking in research on female athletes in general when comparing to their male counterparts. So let's go back to episode 16 with Dr. Melinda Monor.
And it's not uncommon for female athletes to move in and out of a normal menstrual cycle over the training year. So when they're training really hard, they may stop menstruating. And then when they're in the off season and they're not training as much, maybe their period comes back. So we know that having a period, not having a period impacts their health. Their reproductive health is probably somewhat of a snapshot of just how stressed they are, maybe what their cortisol levels are if they're not menstruating. Also, it means that they may or may not be able to get pregnant, and I can expand on that in a minute. If they don't menstruate for years on end, which many female athletes never even really start a normal menstrual cycle and they may be into their 20s, we know that that very negatively impacts their bone health. And you can't play catch up when you've gone too far down the road. So they may go into adulthood with a much lower bone mineral density than they would have or should have had they had a normal menstrual cycle. In general, active women have higher bone mineral density than their sedentary counterparts. Part of that is because of their weight-bearing exercise. If you start young, let's say, into cycling, and cycling is non-weight-bearing, it's the same issue that you get with swimmers, then you don't have that weight-bearing stress on the bones to build more bone. So if you have a cyclist, they're spending hours on the bike. If they don't have some weight-bearing physical activity in their lives, they may not be getting the level of bone. And we actually have seen this in male cyclists and in female cyclists, that their bone mineral density is lower than even their endurance, let's say, runner, who's a counterpart to them.
And I don't think we could have ended this year in the better way. Our last guest and the cherry on top of the cake was having Dr. Trent Stellingworth to talk about his recent narrative review on nutrition for altitude training and cycling. It has been a while since I'd been trying to reach out Trent to be on the show, but finally we made it and this episode really came to be. So please have this brief summary of episode 17, the last one of 2019.
I think if you look at both papers, first and foremost, you need an athlete who's healthy and in a good, consistent training program before launching off into altitude. Secondly, you need a training program that's well thought out and well monitored at altitude. So there's lots of just simple monitoring things that you can put into place to make sure that the athlete is adapting as you hope and as you would. So in that instance, some kind of questionnaire in the morning or hydration check in the morning, periodic body weights are really easy to implement. And then ideally an internal and external load metric that you're able to track over the camp. So in cycling, it could be something like RPE, heart rate, and wattage. Those are three things that are pretty easy to collect in most of your cyclists. So those are two biggies just in and around structuring the camp and monitoring the athlete. When it comes to nutrition, the biggest things, first and foremost, is the iron. It's probably the single most important intervention at low to moderate altitude that we have in terms of evidence. Secondary to that is adequate energy availability throughout the camp. It may not be heightened at low to moderate altitudes, but any training camp situation where athletes are going to go in and thrash themselves for 2 or 3 weeks, that's an important consideration. And then finally, perhaps some increased needs in and around hydration. And that's it. Good wholesome diet, lots of fruits and veggies, eating to satisfy the energy outputs, all the same basic recommendations at sea level. And I think if you can execute those 4 or 5 things I've just mentioned, you're 98, 99% there for having, within reason, successful altitude camps with athletes.
And there you go, the full 2019 yearly digest, summing up all that has been going on here on the podcast. My thanks to all the guest speakers who kindly took the time to be on the podcast, and to you, the listeners, for being there. I hope you remain there for this amazing year that is coming, and I wish you all the best 2020. Stay tuned, guys. Talk to you soon.